After the sirens had sent the people of Liverpool scurrying for cover, the first German bombers appeared overhead at 11:15 that night. There were 50 bombers in all, and they dropped 48 tons of high explosives and 4,000 incendiaries. Perhaps the worst incident that night was a direct hit on an emergency rest centre. 12 women volunteers were killed as they made meals for the homeless. It was the first raid in what was to turn out to be a week of continual bombing.
Liverpool was the biggest seaport outside of London. It was known as the second city of the empire, so it was vital for all the trade of the empire. But the trade between America and Britain became even more important during the period of the war.
Bad weather had cut the raid short that first night, but there was still widespread damage.
Lime Street Station, where Mary and Buster had arrived only hours earlier, had the roof blown off. Meanwhile, down at the docks, German bombers had dropped mines into the Mersey, which caused massive disruption to the ships trying to get in and out of the port.
Not far from the city centre was Liverpool's huge dock complex. In Huskisson Dock, the merchant vessel SS Malakand had just arrived. Its master was Captain Howard Kinley.
He'd taken command of his new ship. Now he was waiting for a new cargo to be loaded. But this wasn't just any old cargo. This was the most dangerous imaginable. 350 tons of high explosives.
The captain, his ship and his crew had survived the bombing on the first night. Now they were preparing to load their cargo of explosives. It would be a test of nerves, even for an experienced skipper like Kinley.
Howard Kinley joined the Merchant Navy at the end of the First World War and rose through the ranks to become captain. He was often away for long periods, travelling to places like India and the Far East, leaving his wife and son at home in Liverpool.
I'm Martin Kinley, son of Captain Howard Cook Kinley.
Today, Martin is 90.
In 1941, my father was in command of the Malakand. He'd been in the RAF in the First World War, but of course in the second he was totally at sea. His flying days are long gone since then.
Having left the RAF, Kinley was now a merchant navy man through and through. Although he was married and had young Martin, the welfare of his crew was never far from his mind.
I'm sure family life was important, but ultimately his job was the main part of his life. He did think of his crew members, I believe, as part of his family as well.
Captain Kinley had only recently taken command of the Malakand. His 72-strong crew were mostly from the Middle East and Asia and spoke almost no English. It's easy to imagine how anxious they must have felt as they loaded the ship with high explosives. Kinley needed to win them over, and he had the ideal way to gain their trust and calm their nerves. He was a member of the Magic Circle. His granddaughter Emma still has his original box of tricks.
It dates back from about 1915, so it's at least 100 years old. We've got some silver hoops that I used in the magic show. These I particularly like. These are my grandfather's gloves, so it's nice to think that this is something that he used to have on his hands. You know, he actually touched these. When I think of my grandfather on board the Malakand, what they were going through, all the stress, they must have been quite frightened. So, you know, it's nice to think that my granddad maybe did a bit of light entertainment.
Kinley used his conjuring skills to bond with his new crew. It may have been just in time. By late afternoon on the 2nd of May, the final cases of explosives were being lifted on board.
Kinley and his crew knew that once the cargo of bombs had been loaded, the Malakand would be a sitting duck for the Luftwaffe.
At airfields in northern France, the German bomber crews were again preparing for a major raid on Liverpool's docks. If Captain Kinley's ship was hit, it would be devastating, not only for his crew and those working at the port, but also for the working-class families that lived nearby.
The Germans weren't saying, oh, let's take out the working class. It wasn't that. It was just the working class were in close proximity to these places like docks, and that's why they were disproportionately hit.
By that first week of May 1941, Britain's ports had become the prime targets for attack.
There have been more than 150 major raids up and down the country. Even places like Belfast and Glasgow that had dared to think they were out of range of the German bombers had been hit. Churchill understood how important morale was to the war effort, so he set off on a tour of Britain. When he got back, he made a speech to the nation. I've seen many painful scenes of havoc and of fine buildings and acres of cottage homes blasted into rubble heaps of ruin. But it is in just those very places where the malice of the savage enemy has done its worst and where the ordeal of the men, women and children has been most severe that I found their morale most high and splendid. But just days after that speech was broadcast, Liverpool was attacked from the air. The Luftwaffe had designated it target number 1.
Just a short distance from Liverpool docks is the district of Wavertree. The Richardson family lived at number 5 Sandhead Street. 20-year-old Flo and her mum Frances and her dad Alf.
My dad was fond of life. He was really what I would call a Liverpool comedian. Always full of humour. You know, like he had different sayings like, if you don't laugh, you cry. He loved life. He really did.
Alf had fought in the trenches in France in World War I. Now in his 40s, he found himself on the front line again.
Apart from working during the daytime, he did so many hours at night time on the docks as an auxiliary fireman.
The war effort depended on men like Alf. As the Luftwaffe stepped up its bombing campaign, these volunteers moved in to help the regular fire service, who were overwhelmed by the scale of the bombing.
Alf spent his nights at the docks on air raid duty. He was one of a crew of 10 men. Their job was extremely dangerous. They had to tackle fires while the bombs continued to fall around them. By the evening of the second day of the May Blitz, the Luftwaffe were in the air and on their way to Liverpool. The siren sounded, sending everyone to their shelters.
Flo and her mother joined their neighbours and headed for the nearest bunker. It was in the playground of the local school. Flo's dad Alf was still in their house. He was getting ready for his night shift as a fireman at the docks. In the shelter, Flo and her mum would have heard the bombers approaching. Sitting in the darkness, they must have been terrified. Even now, aged 98, Flo has vivid memories of that experience.
you hear the drone of the bombers. And if I close my eyes, I can still hear that drone. I can still hear the droning of the engines of them bombers overhead.
The German planes were directly above Flo's house on Sandhead Street.
And you put your hands over your ears, or you all huddled together in the shelter and waited for that whistling to stop. And when that whistling stopped, then you heard the explosion.
That night, a bomb landed yards from Flo's shelter.
The shelter filled with smoke, all black, and you could feel the blast. But had it have been a heavier bomb, it would have been fatal.
As dawn broke, the raid subsided and the all clear sounded. Flo and her mum began to leave the shelter.
They had no idea what they would find outside.
Then, across the playing fields, they caught sight of the bomb-damaged houses here on Sandhead Street.
We got out of the shelter, and as we stood outside, I could see my dad walking over the schoolyard towards us, and he looked in a terrible state.
All through the raid, Flo and her mum had thought Alf was down at the docks on firefighting duty. But that night, he hadn't made it to his shift.
He'd been in the house, getting ready to go on duty. He was trying to get a light to light a cigarette. And when that bomb fell, the blast came down the chimney and he was blown under the table.
Alf was lucky to be alive, although he was suffering from severe shock. He hadn't been able to join his crew on the docks. They'd been busy putting out incendiary bombs into the early hours. Eventually, they had to stop for a break.
They had this particular hut. They used to go into this hut and have a mug of tea and a chat. And this particular night, that hut got a direct hit.
All 9 of Alf Richardson's friends were killed.
He was never the same after that. He just couldn't face it, you know, losing his friends. He had a nervous breakdown.
The day after that heavy raid, the captain of the SS Malakand, Howard Kinley, would have wanted to get his crew and his ship out of the danger zone.
It's not hard to imagine how Captain Kinley might have felt waiting with his ship in the docks. He'd just taken command of his new vessel. Then he'd received orders that he was to carry a cargo of high explosives and that his passage out of the port had been blocked by magnetic mines.
I often think about what he would have gone through. He had such responsibility to his crew members. I'm sure they looked up to him like a father figure.
Großangriff auf Liverpool, den bedeutendsten Versorgungshafen an der Westküste Englands. Auf zahlreichen Flugplätzen werden die Maschinen klar zum Start gemacht.
Late afternoon on the 3rd day, and German ground crews at bases in northern France loaded their planes with high explosives. They'd soon be ready to take off. And once again, Liverpool was in their sights. Just hours later, as Captain Kinley looked at the sky, he would have seen what the Luftwaffe called a bomber's moon. bright moonlight and almost no clouds, perfect blitz weather. His wife and son Martin, just a few miles away, would have had no idea of the danger he was in. German bombers were on their way to attack Liverpool for a third consecutive night. Their principal target was the docks, but close by was Everton, home to the famous football club, and in 1941, the location of Mill Road Hospital. In charge were matron Gertrude Riding and Dr. Leonard Findlay.
At the time of the May Blitz in 1941, Gertrude was 49. She was a single woman who had dedicated herself to looking after others. She trained as a nurse at Mill Road Hospital, working her way up through the ranks, occupying every position until she became matron in 1927. Gertrude worked closely with the doctor who ran the hospital, Leonard Findlay, a man who was dedicated to medicine and the care of others.
My name is Charles Findlay, and I am the third son of Dr. Leonard Findlay. In 1941, my father was the medical superintendent of Mill Road Hospital in Liverpool. He was appointed in 1935 at about the age of 30.
To reach such an important position so young showed how highly regarded Dr. Findlay was and how dedicated. In the lead up to war, he wanted to ensure the hospital could cope with mass casualties.
No doubt he was thinking what they should do if his hospital was hit. I gather some precautions were taken. My father had been warned that there were going to be some air raids. I'm sure my father was very aware of the hospital's proximity to where main bombing targets were. So I'm sure he appreciated that there was a serious risk that the hospital could get hit badly.
Leonard Findlay demanded the best from every member of his team.
My father expected very high standards of all the nursing staff, including, no doubt, the matron and the assistant matron.
The wards at Mill Road Hospital would have been full to capacity. In the first week of May, 2 other hospitals in Liverpool that were closer to the docks had to be evacuated, and some of those patients were moved to Mill Road. On top of that, there would have been many casualties from the previous 2 nights' raids, but the normal day-to-day running of the hospital had to go on. As well as attending to the sick, the hospital was well known for its maternity wing, where lots of babies were being born every day.
On that third night, the German bombers were once again on their way. When matron Gertrude Riding heard that another attack was imminent, she cancelled her leave.
She believed in setting an example, and by all accounts, it seemed to work. Young nurses followed suit and cancelled their leave too. Gertrude was an inspirational leader, but just like many other hospitals, hers was under enormous pressure.
On the night of the 3rd of May, Mill Road was already taking in casualties from bombing incidents around Liverpool. But at that stage, it would have been running reasonably smoothly.
As matron Gertrude Riding and Dr. Findlay prepared for another night of bombing, over in Bedford Street, Mary Lawson and her husband Buster Beaumont were again forced to spend the night being stared at in a public shelter.
Film star Mary Lawson turning up to a public air raid shelter must have been quite a surprise for the locals. Now, some may have seen her in Cinderella at the famous Liverpool Empire Theatre a few years earlier, or others may have simply seen her on the big screen. In the 1940s, Mary was as famous for her relationships as for her acting roles.
A string of well-publicised affairs had kept her name in the papers throughout the 1930s.
Mary was seen stepping out with some of the most eligible bachelors of her day, and she was even engaged to several of them. The most well-known was Fred Perry, the world-famous tennis player, and their relationship caused a sensation. But it was a celebrity love match that wasn't destined to last.
In 1936, on the set of a film, Mary met Francis William Lionel Collins Beaumont, or plain Buster to his friends. He was the son of a Channel Island aristocrat.
At the time, Buster was married and had a son, and the affair scandalised his family. Buster's mother in particular did not approve.
Mary Lawson's niece, Barbara, has inherited a family scrapbook devoted to her aunt. She knows the story of the couple's problems with Buster's family.
Her and Grandad Lawson had a very difficult time when she married him, and they weren't very nice to her. They would not recognise the marriage.
Mary was not only an actress with a racy reputation, but she was also a working-class lass from Darlington. Despite his mother's threats to ostracise him, he went ahead anyway. He filed for divorce and married his glamorous film star lover, Mary.
At the time, it was a very brave move.
Divorce still attracted scandal, and it also caused tensions between him and his family. His family is an incredibly well-off. His mother was the Dame of Sark, and Mary has these humble working-class beginnings, and that compounds the issue. So it wasn't easy for him to leave his first marriage and to then marry Mary. I think it brought with it an awful lot of stigma.
But despite the challenges they faced, Mary and Buster went ahead and got married. That night in the air raid shelter, their presence would have likely raised morale and possibly a few eyebrows. The couple must have felt like they were wasting their one precious week together, sitting in a cold and damp shelter. Meanwhile, at Mill Road Hospital, Gertrude Riding and her nurses were trying to move their patients to the basement. But not all the pregnant mothers could make it down the stairs.
But in the maternity ward, many mothers were confined to bed. The nurses pulled their beds away from the wall and gave some mothers their babies to hold. It was the best they could do to protect them from the bomb blasts that they feared were heading their way.
On that third night, over at 34 Wycombe Street, Margaret Johnson was gathering her children together and trying to keep them calm as the siren sounded. They'd been bombed out of their home earlier in the war. Their new house wasn't really big enough for all 8 of them, 2 adults and 6 children.
On the night of May the 3rd, 1941, only 3 of the children were at home with their mother, Margaret. There was 15-year-old Peter, 7-year-old John, and the baby, also named Margaret. Margaret's husband would most likely have been at work.
The other 3 children were staying with relatives nearby.
As the air raid sirens sounded, Margaret picked up her baby and quickly ushered the 2 boys out of the house. Her neighbours had an air raid shelter in their back garden, so she headed straight there. It was the only place nearby that offered any kind of protection.
It was next door. It wasn't in her own sort of patch. They went to the shelter. The bombs started coming over in the early hours of the morning.
Margaret and her children were trying to protect themselves in the Anderson shelter. They knew what was coming. The idea of using aerial bombardment to terrorize civilians wasn't new.
In the lead-up to the war, nobody really had any illusions about the destructive power of air bombardment. Ever since the plane had become a weapon in the First World War, it was the aspect of modern warfare that people feared the most. The idea of terrorizing civilian populations by the wholesale bombing of their cities was the guiding principle behind the blitz. It hadn't come from nowhere. In the interwar years, the German military had developed the belief that by mercilessly pounding cities, they could erode the morale of the populations and ensure a swift surrender. The tactic was powerfully demonstrated in 1937 with the destruction of the Basque town of Guernica in the Spanish Civil War. The attack on Guernica blew up a city, but it shocked the world. Now everybody knew about the brutal realities of aerial bombardment, and indeed what the Luftwaffe was capable of. Bombing came to be seen as the future of modern warfare, and civilians were firmly in the firing line.
Although Hitler was now focused on obliterating strategic targets like the Liverpool docks, families living nearby would inevitably be hit.
The German bombing campaign did have economic targets, and clearly they wanted to knock out shipping, merchant shipping especially. They also had this idea that they would punish Britain. So the idea was, and it grew in the Second World War, and we adopted it as well, let the civilians face the severity of war, and morale will go down, and support for the war will drain away, and maybe they'll come to a political settlement with Germany.
On the night of the 3rd of May 1941, the Luftwaffe were closing in on Liverpool in even greater numbers than before. Almost 300 bombers were primed to attack the city. Hundreds of thousands of people were cowering in their shelters. Margaret Johnson and her children were among them.
The night of Saturday, the 3rd of May, would turn out to be Liverpool's worst night of bombing so far. The German aircraft concentrated on the docks and the surrounding area. It was a relentless, devastating attack. The weather favoured the Germans. There was little cloud, and a bright half-moon lit up the night sky.
At the docks, Captain Kinley's crew were getting ready to tackle the incendiary bombs they expected to fall that night.
Kinley knew his ship and his crew were in very real danger, but he took his duties as a captain seriously. Despite the risks, he was determined to stay with the Malakand, to protect the ship and its cargo of high explosive bombs.
Captain Howard Kinley's ship was just one of hundreds of merchant vessels crammed into the docks in Liverpool during the first week of May 1941. The safe passage of these ships into and out of Liverpool was vital. Everything was coordinated right here in the heart of the city. In the basement of this office building was a command centre, controlling the movement of ships across the Atlantic.
The ships were organised into protected convoys. They were vital to Britain's survival and ultimately victory in World War II. They called it the Battle of the Atlantic. Today, there are many historians who think it was the most important battle of the war, and it was run from this building here in Liverpool. Hidden in the basement, a secret command centre.
For many of the hundreds of men and women who worked in these dark basement rooms, this became their home. And as the bombs rained down above ground, the staff continued their vital work. To protect them from enemy attack, the basement was bomb-proofed with walls that were 7 feet thick. Over at Mill Road Hospital, they didn't have anywhere near that level of protection. There, the surgeons were attempting to carry out operations in a makeshift theatre in the basement as the sound of the bombs got closer. The work of the hospital had to continue, despite the bombers flying overhead.
My father must have been incredibly anxious. But what can you do? You've got bombers flying overhead. It's night time. You're in charge of a hospital of up to 700 patients and all the staff, you've got to keep your head down and hope for the best and carry on treating and nursing.
As they worked into the night, Leonard Findlay and Gertrude Riding could hear the sound of bombs in the distance. As the raid got closer to the docks, one of the only lines of defense were barrage balloons. Littering the night sky, these balloons looked like airships, tethered by ropes to anchor points on the ground. They were filled with highly flammable hydrogen gas, and enemy aircraft had to avoid them in order to drop their bombs.
That night, the Germans began their attack on the docks. Not with high explosives, but with slow-burning incendiary bombs. These were designed to start intense fires wherever they landed, causing chaos and confusion on the ground.
One of these incendiary bombs hit a barrage balloon at Huskisson Dock, close to Captain Kinley's ship. It collapsed right onto the SS Malacan.
As the balloon ruptured, its hydrogen gas burst out and ignited. It was now like a giant flamethrower spraying fire all across the deck of the ship. And beneath the decks in the hold were hundreds of tons of high explosive shells.
Kinley and his crew fought the fire with everything they had. For a moment, it seemed like they were winning.
Successfully beating back the flames. But all around them, incendiary bombs rained down, hitting the warehouse on the south side of the dock, the one closest to the ship, with an inferno raging just feet away. Inevitably, the flames enveloped the Malakand. Now, Kinley and his crew were fighting fires on all fronts, surrounded by burning warehouses right next to the ship, with the ship itself on fire and the heat and smoke driving them back. The crew were overwhelmed.
That night's raid had only just begun. It would turn out to be one of the biggest onslaughts Liverpool or Britain had ever faced.
The German bombers were now blasting their prime target, the Liverpool docks. The SS Malakand, a ship loaded with high explosives, was in serious danger. Captain Howard Kinley and his crew were desperately trying to fight the multiple fires that were raging across the decks.
Meanwhile, film star Mary Lawson was huddled inside a communal shelter with her husband Buster.
As the bombs continued to fall, large parts of the city were already devastated, and Liverpudlians held their breath in fear of what was to come.
Next time, Margaret Johnson and her 3 children find themselves at the heart of the Blitz. Mary Lawson and her husband Buster try to salvage their time together with a risky decision. And Captain Howard Kinley is faced with an impossible choice.